recently the Israeli government sent shockwaves around the world when it announced a blacklist of groups that have been pushing for a program of what is known as BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel for its policies against Palestinians. Here to join us now to discuss that blacklist is the co-director of one of the affected groups. At least two groups that have been on this show a number of times are included in that blacklist, or Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been represented on the show multiple times, and CODEPINK are both named. Ariel Gold is co-director, national co-director for CODEPINK. She also directs CODEPINK's Middle East campaigns, and that includes bringing Palestinian activists to the United States to discuss their situation, and she joins us now. So first of all, Ariel, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Secondly, did this announcement come as a shock, a surprise? Did you have any intimations that it was coming, or did it more or less come out of the blue for you?
I really wasn't surprised at all. Israel has been banning people since 1948, when they expelled 700,000 Palestinians from their lands and homes in order to form the so-called Jewish state. I was in Palestine this past summer, staying in the West Bank city of Hebron, and the right-wing extremists who have really taken over the country of Israel launched a campaign to demand that because of my politics, because of my criticism of Israel, and because I work directly in solidarity with Palestinian activists on the ground there, that I should be actively expelled and deported from the country. They weren't able to do that at the time, but the Minister of Internal Security, who is the same person who put out this blacklist, personally responded to the media that I wouldn't be allowed back into the country. And, you know, Israel's been kind of threatening us for quite a while with this blacklist. And also this past summer, and this is while I was there, they refused entry to an interfaith delegation of Muslims, Jews, and Christians, including a rabbi. So this came as no surprise from a repressive apartheid state. It is really disgusting, though.
Yeah, you know, I certainly agree with you. And were you part of this interfaith delegation that you just mentioned?
I wasn't. I was there at the time in the West Bank, and I was, you know, waiting to see them. And that was quite a shocking move when they refused to allow Americans to board their flight in Washington, D.C. But, you know, Israel has just created these red lines where they've said, if you're critical of us, you're not welcome here. And over the years, it's become this idea of if you're Jewish and you're critical of us, then you're a bad and unacceptable Jew, and you're not part of, you know, this so-called safe haven for all Jews. It's a really absurd and revolting situation. And, you know, there's nothing that is more nonviolent than a boycott campaign. So ultimately, Israel is just further exposing themselves for the repressive regime that they are. And this serves to further the movement. It allows the world to see more openly the kind of state that they are. And so I think it's going to bolster our campaigns and our work.
You know, you mentioned this argument, this bad Jew argument, I guess I would call it. And I don't know if you are Jewish or not, but I do know that I remember a period where I was being told I wasn't personally sufficiently Jewish to consider moving to Israel. Not that I was, but I was insufficiently Jewish because my mother was a convert to the wrong branch of Judaism, and yet at the same time I was also being told by people I was a bad Jew because I was supporting Palestinian rights as I have for many years. So I've often wondered how one could be both insufficiently Jewish by birth and yet a bad Jew by nature at the same time. But maybe that's my own personal unique problem. I don't know.
So I am Jewish, and you know, Judaism or Zionism, as we should frame this very carefully, is really this. It's become this thing in modern Judaism, or with the influence of Zionism, that Jews are allowed to be critical of anything. You can criticize God. You cannot believe in God. You can debate really just about anything except for the state of Israel. And for me as a Jew, and I'm a practicing Jew, I belong to the Union for Reform Judaism. For me as a Jew, this is a real insult. You know, historically, and for many, many, many generations and millennium, Judaism has been about deep thought and debate and discussion. And now we have this modern so-called, state that is defining itself as speaking for all Jews and saying that there is no discussion on this issue and that we are not allowed to discuss human rights for Palestinians. I find it incredibly just racist and un-Jewish, if you ask me.
You know, it reminds me, and I didn't, and again, we're talking with Ariel Gold, co-director of CODEPINK, about the blacklist of groups by the government of Israel. And Ariel, I didn't expect the conversation to go this way, but I am going to mention also that many years ago, when I was kind of searching for a spiritual home, and we had small children in the house, I looked at some of the synagogues. At the time, we had just moved out to Los Angeles, where I no longer live, but I remember the best-known liberal congregation there, as it was described to me by everyone, said, "We believe in questioning and debate and inquiry," at one part of their website. In another part, it said, we do not tolerate criticism of Israel. In this,
exactly.
So I know exactly what you're talking about, unfortunately. And going back to your point about BDS, you know, people need to understand whether they support it or not. A campaign for sanctions is speech. It is not any kind of violent action. It is, in fact, an articulation of a point of view and a recommendation to others that they adhere to a certain path. In this case, one that has been asked of them by the Palestinian people. But it is so the idea that organizations are being banned from Israel, including an explicitly Jewish organization like Jewish Voice for Peace, is, I would presume, shocking to many Americans. But I do also want to bring up, in the context of this conversation, that we are also seeing here in the United States what I would describe as a concerted campaign to suppress and even outlaw speech about BDS here at home as well. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Yeah, and that's run by pro-Israel groups and individuals, and it's an imposition on our First Amendment, and serves to undermine U.S. democracy. And this isn't the only time that pro-Israel groups or the state of Israel have interfered with the running of the American government and impinged on American democracy. I want to also mention that, while we're seeing these crackdowns and the release of this new blacklist, that it's also in the backdrop of an increasing amount of repression and attacks that are taking place on the people on the ground in Palestine. So, we have the people of Gaza living without electricity in really dire circumstances. And in the West Bank, just since Trump's declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, we have been watching a really intense crackdown on peaceful activists there. And even before then, so I think most of us have heard about the arrest of 16-year-old activist Tamimi, who they are continuing to hold in a Israeli detention cell. And there's many others in addition to her as well. She's a really exceptional case, being a teenage girl. But many of the leaders and organizers of the peaceful resistance have been arrested and either released on bail or continuing to be held in detention at this moment.
And Ahed Tamimi, for those who may not recall, she is I believe she's a 16-year-old girl who slapped an Israeli soldier. But and she's being held under very draconian conditions from all reports. I also, by the way, Ariel, saw a report of a Israeli settler who committed an act of violence against a member of the IDF, I guess it was, and maybe with Ahed too, and was not even prosecuted. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I didn't.
Sure. I am familiar. I'm both familiar and unsurprised. So the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem is that they are all, from children through adulthood, subject to military law. Israel is the only country in the world that subjects children to a military court system. But all civilians, Palestinian civilians in those areas, are under military law. At the same time, Israeli settlers who are living illegally on stolen land are held under Israeli civilian law, and really with no accountability. But military law there is such an intense and oppressive force. So, for example, we have Military Law 101, which criminalizes any criticism or protest of the occupation they live under. Under Military Law 101, it is illegal for 10 or more Palestinians to gather for the purposes of discussing politics or any sort of protest or dissent. By nature, that's immediately illegal. So when Palestinians come out to protest, their very circumstances that they're living in, even the most nonviolent protest, is illegal. You have to get a permit to protest. And we can imagine how Israel feels about giving out permits for Palestinians to protest the Israeli government.
So where does all this leave us? And again, we're talking with Ariel Gold, co-director of CODEPINK, now officially banned by the Israeli government. So where does that, just looking forward to the future, I mean, it seems to me that the Israeli government is getting more and more openly repressive beyond the occupied areas of Palestine. It seems to me, and by the way, I don't, and I'm sure you don't either, I do note the irony of the fact that the suspension of rights of traveler speech for Americans and Europeans receives worldwide attention, while the daily suppression of the rights of Palestinians seems to go so frequently unnoted. There's a certain irony there, I would say, but given the fact that this is now becoming more and more open, this pattern of repression, where do we go for the future? I mean, a lot of people are saying, we had James Zogby on the show recently, we've had others saying the two-state solution is no longer realistic. What is your sense of potential futures for Israel and Palestine look like now?
Well, I don't think we're in a place of talking about solutions at this point. At this point, things are getting really worse and worse on the ground. We also have the situation with Jerusalem and the U.S. in process of, preparing to move the embassy. So I think this is really a question of working on a daily basis on human rights. So at CODEPINK right now, we're working very hard for the release of Ahed Tamimi. We had a protest yesterday in Washington, D.C. We are calling for protests around the world on January 31st. That's Ahed's 17th birthday. and we'll be asking for people to take to the streets for that. People can also sign our petition for our AHED. That's at codepink.org /free AHED, and that's AHED. And we're not taking this blacklist lying down either. So, you know, while you said that this is getting a lot more press than the repression on the ground, at the same time, one of the things that this is doing is it's cutting off Palestinian activists on the ground from having access to their supporters and those like myself who go to work actively on the ground in solidarity. And that's one of the purposes of this blacklist, is to really cut the people off there from support. So we're going to be working on this, and you will hear more from us about it as we move forward.
Well, I hope you come back on the show and discuss it as well. We've had Medea Benjamin, also co-director of CODEPINK. She's been on the program, and co-founder. She's been on. I hope you will come back as well so that we can continue.
Anytime.
Well, we appreciate it. Ariel Gold of CODEPINK. Thanks for the good work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me on.